now, which is the options to reform legislation governing transport in Auckland. And I understand that we are going to have an introduction from Mayor Brown, and then we will have a presentation from Max Hardy, Chief of Staff, Alistair Cameron, Manager, and Katie Bexley, Legal Counsel for Public Law. So I think probably the best place to start, given the nature of this recommendation, is with the Mayor. So Mayor Brown, I hand over to you.
Thank you for that. I'm actually in the odd position of being the author and signatory on this one. It's so exciting. Auckland's system of planning transport is broken and in desperate need of fixing. It's way too complex, there are too many parties involved, and it's not properly joined up. Agreements made between Council and the Crown, including the Mayor and Minister, can be contradicted or relitigated every step of the way. So we can announce grand plans every 3 years as part of ATAP only to see them ignored. We politicians are elected to set direction, but in Auckland we have no real say over what transport projects proceed and which do not. I don't need to remind anyone here that this is a major source of frustration for Aucklanders. I'm proposing 2 ways of fixing this. Firstly, a joint committee with the government to agree an integrated transport plan for Auckland, which will agree the direction for transport in Auckland and ensure major projects are coordinated. This provides a statutory basis for some of what is being done anyway, the ATAP process and the integrated plan. It isn't only about projects, it's also about funding, revenue and governance. Secondly, the regional land transport plan needs to be developed and approved by Auckland Council rather than by a committee largely comprising of Auckland Transport Board members. Of course, Auckland Transport needs to be closely involved in that. Their expertise is important, and we will work constructively with them in delivering a better system, but it must be for us elected members to approve the final plan. We're the only council not like that. I intend to lobby all political parties for this necessary legislative change, and I've made good progress on that already. There is an appetite for this. However, Council also needs to step up and take initiative. Councils have the power to introduce legislation as a local bill, which we should make use of where appropriate. I'm proposing that staff work up a local bill over the next month to bring back to the governing body for our consideration. After some further discussion, I'm also proposing a few additional resolutions to this, which I've put forward here, and which ask that they be accepted as a Chair's recommendation. This reflects our intent to work with AT in developing the solution and also getting a change and approach underway in the meantime, not waiting. Okay, that's my background for that, and I'll hand over to the staff, but thank you for letting me address you, Chairperson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and the Mayor has said most of what I was planning on saying, but I'll just quickly go through the presentation that has been prepared, which follows on from the workshop you had as a group, I think it was last week. I should probably note that it also follows on from issues that have been raised by councillors in previous political terms, as well as the CCO review, which considered the issue of who had responsibility for preparing and agreeing, mostly agreeing the regional land transport plan. So this isn't a new issue, but it sort of builds on things that have been discussed over a period of years. What are the issues? The Mayor's already got into these, so I won't labour them. I think you saw this diagram at the workshop last week, which goes some way to trying to explain the complexity of the planning and investment framework in Auckland, which is simply just overly complex. There's too many decision makers and not enough coordination and integration between Auckland and Wellington. I should probably note that the proposed reforms to the Resource Management Act, and water will only add to the complication and make this worse, not better. It's probably worth noting that as funding becomes an increasing issue for both local and central government, a range of sort of parallel and bespoke arrangements have been sort of added into the system, and new agencies have been created, which again add to the complexity of the system. And I think complexity is the enemy of efficiency and effectiveness in this case. I think one of the other issues that the Mayor highlighted is what some would argue is a democratic deficit in decision making. As the Mayor rightly pointed out, Auckland Council is the only unitary authority in New Zealand that doesn't have elected members aside from the councillors appointed to the Auckland Transport Board, sitting around the Regional Transport Committee. I think what that results in is, as a collective group, you don't really have any meaningful role in transport planning in Auckland other than to strike the rate to fund it all. So effectively your role is to decide how much to rate the people of Auckland to pay for other people's decisions. Oh, this slide just covers off what I was talking about in terms of who sits on regional transport committees. I should also note that over the last few years there have been attempts to sort of improve the governance of planning and investment in Auckland. Things like the ATAP process with central government. I think the fundamental issue there is that it's non-statutory and not binding. So you can reach agreement with the government and then it doesn't necessarily guarantee that what's agreed in there will be funded. And I think, yeah, there's also a joint non-legislative approach to jointly preparing the RLTP with Auckland Transport. So there are other measures that have been tried to deal with these issues. As the Mayor has suggested, he wants to progress legislative change to actually change the laws around who agrees what in Auckland. As discussed at the workshop, there's two paths you can go down here. One is government-led legislative reform, or the second and recommended is a local bill which puts the onus more on you to drive it and to actually get this on the legislative program. The disadvantage of waiting for the government to lead the process is it may never become a priority for them, and there's no certainty that they'll whatever new government is formed post-October will pick this up and run with it. On the slide here is the preferred option for the local bill. Just a couple of things I want to note. One is the Joint Transport Committee at the top, which would have responsibility for developing and agreeing a long-term integrated transport plan for Auckland, which would be made up with representatives from both Auckland and Wellington, and beneath that the Auckland Regional Transport Committee, which would have responsibility for developing and approving the Auckland Regional Transport Plan. I think there's some options about who would sit on either one of those committees, and that's part of the work that would have to be sort of discussed and agreed if you decide to progress a local bill, filling out some of the detail of exactly who would sit on there, but there are some options there. And look, I won't labour these too much, but the benefits of the preferred option, I think it just reflects that the important roles that both the Crown as a substantial funder and Auckland Council play in the transport system. And it tries to bring it into alignment with the rest of the country, but also aims for greater integration of investment planning with Wellington so that we can try to get biggest bang for the buck, which in a constrained funding environment I think is pretty crucial. I think it's fair to say that this won't solve the funding problems, but I'd like to think that it would help improve it. But I don't think we should shy away from the fact that revenue to fund transport in Auckland should remain a priority, and we need to think of ways to solve that issue as well. And I'll just leave it on the what we would do here if you go with this option today. I think it's a two-pronged approach as set out there. One is advocating to the incoming government for legislative change, but rather than waiting for a government to pick it up and run with it, to actually draft a local bill, work through with you and with Auckland Transport what the actual detail of that bill would be, and bring that back here so we can actively go to Wellington and say this is what Auckland Council would like. I don't think I've got anything else to add there. If Max, you've got nothing, so look, happy to take questions.
Thanks, Alistair. I open up to the room for questions then. Councillor Foley.
Kia ora, thank you, Chair, and thank you, team, for the workshop, but also for today's presentation. Just a question around the cost, I guess. If we do approve the preferred option, will this be worked on totally in-house by our in-house legal team with existing budgets, or will we be spending some money on external legal consultants?
I believe our resource is sitting to my right, and if you want to call her a legal team, she's an army of one, but she will be doing the drafting of the local bill. I don't think there's any plan at this stage to get any outside help on this. I think most of the effort will be working with yourselves and Auckland Transport and Katie to come up with what an acceptable local bill would be.
Kia ora, thank you.
Good question. Councillor Dalton.
Could I just have a look at the Chair's recs?
Yeah, sure.
Thank you.
So we'll put them up.
Thanks.
You got a question now that you've had a chance to read?
Oh, I guess I'm happy to see F, because I was concerned when I read the Chair and Deputy Chair's letter that came in last evening, and I thought, honestly, we've been very clear we need to improve our relationship and respect for each other, and I hope that this is the way forward on that. Thank you. I appreciate that.
Yes, thank you, Councillor Dalton. Yes, we do have a couple of questions. Councillor Philippina online.
Thank you, Chair, and my apologies for not being there. Alistair, who are the other people that you referred to in your presentation? Who were you referring to?
You might need to be more specific. My mind's getting a bit foggy. What part of my presentation?
It was right at the beginning when you had a look at that cumbersome chart and you were saying there's other people who have decision making.
There's probably others in the room that can speak to this more knowledgeability, but you've got central government who, as evidenced by the Herald articles today, issue a GPS. Outside of that, there's also central government decisions on bespoke projects, which tend to be the bigger scale things, such as City Rail Link, Auckland Light Rail, etc. You've also got Waka Kotahi, who their board sits there and also makes decisions around funding investment. So even though something might get agreed through a process such as ATAP, the Waka Kotahi board still has a separate role in deciding about funding for the projects within that. ATAP in itself was other decision makers, as I understand it. That was, I think the Minister of Transport was involved directly in decision making around that, as well as Kiwi Rail. Sorry, my apologies, I'm feeling a bit under the weather at the moment. So you've got Kiwi Rail and the like, and once projects actually move into an implementation phase as well, you've got other entities such as City Rail Link, which have been established, and some of the decisions that sit around there have impacts on the wider network as well. So it's trying to get an integrated view and appreciation from all of those decision makers that the decisions that they make have impacts on the wider transport network, and try to get a coordinated view of that.
So, Alistair, can you go through the PowerPoint with that cumbersome PowerPoint you had up there? Can you go back to that? And was that sent out to elected members, independent Māori statutory boards, your presentation?
I believe it's on Nexus, and that diagram.
I've just had a look on Nexus. I haven't seen it. Yeah.
Yeah, and that diagram itself, I believe, is actually in the paper, although it's probably so small it'll be illegible in there. But I understand it was sent out at the workshop last week and is in Nexus and it was sent yesterday, I'm being told.
Okay, look, the reason I asked whether it was sent out to, because on my right-hand side of that chart, you've got Auckland Transport. Now, you've mentioned the other people and you've mentioned quite a bit. Is this local bill that you referred to, is that local bill trying to fix what I'm seeing in front of me, or just what the right-hand side on the blue? What is this going to fix?
Hopefully everything. I'm an eternal optimist, councillor. But I think, and this is partly what goes to the options around who sits on the relevant committees here, because I think the overall objective here is the Auckland Council and Crown to jointly make integrated decisions about planning for the Auckland transport system. And the Crown covers a number of entities that sat within that diagram, whether it's Kiwi Rail, Waka Kotahi, etc. So it's somehow trying to develop a system which includes all the decision makers on that page. I think the aspect of this that relates directly to the right-hand side of that diagram with Auckland Transport is purely the responsibility for the Regional Land Transport Plan, which currently sits with AT, and part of this proposal is to make that your responsibility as the governing body.
Yeah. And Chair, sorry about the questions. I just need to get my head around. Sorry, Chair. Just got a couple of more. Alistair, if you go through to the slide that's got CCO review was non-legislative, with that CCO review, it came through and it was suggested. So we're just going against the suggestion from the CCO review and looking for a local bill?
The suggestion from the CCO review was to try to find a way of working collaboratively with Auckland Transport to develop the RLTP, and if that couldn't work, then to seek legislative change. So the CCO review sort of had a bob each way on it.
And have we attempted what was in the CCO review regarding the non-legislative approach?
From memory, when the CCO review was reported up and its recommendations agreed, the previous RLTP was pretty close towards being sort of finalised and agreed, so there wasn't a great deal of time following that recommendation to try to do a fully integrated approach or joint approach at preparing and approving the RLTP. A paper will be coming to this committee, I think, next month, with a proposal how the next RLTP will be jointly developed between Auckland Council and Auckland Transport, which will try it. I think the issue is, so in short, I don't think it's been given a proper go yet.
Yeah.
But I think one of the points here that has been raised by a number of councillors over a long period of time is that lack of democratic accountability for the Regional Land Transport Plan, which everywhere else in the country it is elected members who sit on that Regional Transport Committee.
Yeah, 3 more quick questions. Sorry, Chair. Look, I just need to, because I'm not really sort of heading in the same space as the recommendations are. Alistair, from your opinion, should we try what the CCO review indicated around the non-legislative before we go to public bill? What are the cons with the local bill? And the last question is, do you know why under section 38 of the Local Government Auckland Council Amendment, why Auckland Transport was established? So those are the 3 quick questions. Sorry, Alistair.
There's a lot packed into those, Councillor. I think I'll go in reverse order. Why was Auckland Council? Why was Auckland Transport appointed? Look, that goes back to the days of the Royal Commission as to why it was a good idea to have a standalone transport entity. I would note that on amalgamation, Auckland Council had responsibility for developing the regional land transport strategy, so the strategic end of what is now an RLTP, and Auckland Transport had responsibility for the regional land transport program, which gave effect to that strategy. In 2013, the government changed that. So in many ways, what's proposed is taking us back to what was envisaged on amalgamation. I hope you don't ask me why the government changed things in 2013, because I can't answer that. I've rambled on so long, Councillor, I've forgotten your earlier questions. I should have taken them in the right order.
Well, the first one of the 3 was, wouldn't it be better to do what the CCO review has indicated to do, because you said that we hadn't had the opportunity with the last one. Wouldn't it be better before we then jump to this legislative change? And the second question of the 3, and you answered the third, is what are the cons?
I think the first one is an inherently political question rather than one for me to give advice on. I think, what would I say to that? I think the CCO model is premised on council setting the strategic direction and CCOs implementing. And perhaps I'll just leave that one there. Max, do you want to?
Yeah, thanks, Alison. Thank you, Councillor, for the question. I think it's a good question to go back to the CCO review. In our opinion, the recommendations put forward here are consistent with what the CCO review found, which was that the current legislative arrangements are wrong in principle. So if they're wrong in principle, legislative change is one way of fixing that. We have also, and it's useful looking at the Chair's recommendation that's been put forward initially by the Mayor, which emphasises that, alongside legislative change, this is sort of D and E. What's being put forward there is a suggestion consistent with what the CCO review said, which is that the council and Auckland Transport work more closely together in developing the regional RLTP. So that reflects the CCO review, and I suppose it is a political question for councillors to decide whether you also want to pursue legislative change. But in our view, the recommendations put here are entirely consistent with the CCO review's position.
Okay, look, thanks, John, and I reserve my right to speak, but I don't think it reflects Max, just to let you know that the non-legislative, we're going through the public, so that's an argument I'll end up with the debate. Kilda.
Okay, thank you, Councillor Filipino. We have a number of other councillors now. Councillors Newman, Darby, Baker, Member Renata, and Councillor Lee. Councillor Newman.
Reserving my right to speak, but can I ask, so agree with the intent here. It feels to me more like a government bill than a local bill. So can I just get a sense, if you had any feedback from ministers about their appetite for this matter to be incorporated into a piece of government legislation to follow?
Thank you, Councillor. I think I'm the right person to answer that question. So there's been a number of conversations with ministers and with opposition spokespeople from various parties about this. In fact, there was conversations with ministers started before the last local elections with the previous mayor around seeking legislative change along these lines, and the position taken by the government then and subsequently was, while they support the intent of the council's, what the council's seeking here and the change that we're looking for, they didn't consider it a priority for government legislation. So the conversation then moved to, well, if we put forward this as a local bill, would that be something that you would support? And the indication we've had from both opposition and the government is that that's something that they would encourage us to do. Now there is a legitimate question around the proper scope of a government bill and how, a local bill, and how you can sort of pitch that. The recommendation that we've put forward is really having it both ways. So we seek government intervention, but we also get on and with doing the work to put forward, this is an idea around how we would do things. Now, if that ultimately isn't considered appropriate for a local bill, well, then there's a ready-made package for the government to pick up. But certainly this is a way of us pushing it along. So it's a valid question, but that's really where the tactics come in.
Councillor Darby.
Thank you. Just in terms of the D, Mayor, I just want to acknowledge your accommodation with the F as well, to build a collaborative process. Thank you for that. Just in terms of the D, I gather that's making a request of the Auckland Transport Board, is it not? Because they have the statutory responsibility right now. Barry, are you satisfied that that's going clear, that it's a request of the board? And while we're thinking about that, just in terms of the Auckland Council side, can I have some clarification as to what part of the council are we talking about? The Transport Strategy Unit of Council working with Auckland Transport? Is that the intention? Sorry, Alistair. Yeah.
I think to the second part, yes, it would be my expectation it would be the Transport Strategy team working on this.
And would I be right in assuming that, you know, any future reports, and I appreciate this report needs political author with the mayor, and in the future reports would be the authorising persons would be Chief Executive delegated and Chief Executive of Auckland Transport delegated, if they so choose.
For the RLTP work.
Not just for anything that's coming to this committee related to the RLTP as shown there. I'm assuming that the chief executives of the respective organisations, or whoever they delegate their authorising to, would be the authors of the report.
To be fair, I hadn't thought about that. It would certainly, from here on in, will be staff reports, and at the very least, it would have to include Auckland Transport's view of things, whether it's jointly signed out or not. We can discuss, but it depends what the committee would like.
Yeah, look, that would be good. And I think it would be really good to, if there are diverging views between this Auckland Council organisation and the Auckland Transport organisation, it would be good to make those really clear.
I think the undertaking that we can give you, irrespective of who signs out the report, is that we will include the views of Auckland Transport in future reporting.
Thank you, thank you.
Got Councillor Baker now.
So just a very quick one. So with, I guess, F, does that create a conflict with A2? And so A2 seems to be very, very, prescriptive in what it's saying. And I'm taking into reference the letter from the chair and deputy chair of the AD board. But is that tying us into something, or is that because, or is F? I'm just worried if we're going to enter into a collaborative way of working. It's that A2 is very, very prescriptive, and it might be a question for you, Your Worship. I don't know. It just seems to me it's sort of counterproductive a little bit.
No, I don't think so. I mean, the thing is, ultimately, we do want to have the lead role, because it will be ours that we are responsible for. But F is telling us that in order to produce that, we're going to work collaboratively with them, so that we're not going to produce something or other that they're not unaware of. It's one of the problems we're overcoming, because we had, for instance, zero collaboration from the Waiterbata Harbour Crossing team, and we didn't get collaboration from the Auckland Light Rail until fairly well through the piece, but then we did get some. And even the City Rail Link, whilst that was a joint thing right from the very start, we never actually had control of the money. So we've had the embarrassing and nasty situation of having to fine 537 million because we didn't have a real controlling say. So I think that they are collaborative and those things, but it was a very good question. Thank you.
Okay, Member Renata.
Just a quick question, and it's around the proposed option here. What's the strategy in terms of Māori engagement in the decision making throughout all levels that you propose up on the diagram up there?
So the question is about decision making in the proposed structure with the joint decision making committee in the Auckland, so in the future state rather than developing it.
That's correct.
Look, that's detail that needs to be worked through. And that will have to be included in the detail of the local bill that it's developed, so we'll need to work with this committee to figure that out. And as I mentioned before, there's sort of options around memberships of committees, how these, plans will be developed and what engagement processes will be gone through. But Max, you might have something to add.
Well, the Mayor might actually.
The whole point is to bring IMSB into some position of power. We're all locked out at the moment, and so that's one of the byproducts of that was your position on this here, and the IMSB members will be part of the producing of the regional land transport plan, which you are not at the moment.
Well, thanks for that explanation. It's just that you explain the different boards, Auckland Transport, City Link, Rail Link and whatnot. I never heard anything else, nor did I hear IMSB. Anyway.
Yes, thank you, Mayor. I think that's a good question and a pointed one. And I think that our position is that the recommendation here provides an opportunity to enhance and increase the representation of mana whenua and IMSB in particular on in decision making on transport matters. So there's certainly by bringing things closer to the council, that sort of probably goes with the territory then. So I think the details of how that works aren't in the paper, but that would be the next step to work with the IMSB and others to work through those details.
Oh, just to flow on from that, the how in terms of iwi mātau waka is definitely engaged and the delivery of it is approved. The issue I'm talking about is more about the decision making throughout that structure that Alistair had placed up.
Look, I think all I can say to that is that's all yet to be worked through. This is the very start of a conversation. Well, sorry, the workshop last week was the very start of this conversation, and that's just detail that will need to be worked through, and an important detail at that.
Right, okay. Thank you, Member Renata. And we've got Councillor Lee.
Yes, before I ask the question, just I think Councillor Filipina mentioned the Local Government Auckland Council Amendment Act and the purposes of Auckland Transport, and I have it here, and AT directors may remember that I would kind of repeat this every now and then. The purpose of Auckland Transport is to contribute to an effective and efficient land transport system to support Auckland's social, economic, environmental and cultural well-being. I won't discuss that any further, but my question is, in regard to regional transport committees and I think joint regional transport committees, in the Act, it says, in the case of Auckland, the governing body, these can be the governing body of Auckland Transport, which is the situation, or a joint regional transport committee that includes Auckland Transport as a member. Is that, a lot of these clauses get repealed and changed all the time, so is that still valid? My question is, if we can't get a private member's bill or legislation change, is there options within the existing legislation to achieve what the Mayor is looking for?
I'm conscious I'm surrounded by two actual lawyers as opposed to a retired one. I do not.
Which provision of the Act?
Yeah, my understanding is that there's not scope within the current legislation, but we'll frantically check that. Which section were you looking at, sorry?
Well, we could come back later on that, I think. Okay, thank you.
Right, so if you get back to Councillor Lee on that one, that'd be appreciated. Councillor Fletcher and Councillor Dalton to finish us off.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I would like to speak a little later on, but I'd like to ask some questions from those who have supported us through this process on the practical ways that this might be advanced. And I ask that in the context of the questions put by Councillor Newman. Both Maurice Williamson and I have some experience on private members' bills, local bills, and all of those sorts of things. And there might be a tendency to try and do a deep dive today to get all of the intricate details of this. My question to you, from your most recent experience, if you can gain the support of a local member or, you know, whatever method that gets the bill before the House, it strikes me that the most important thing is that you get it referred to a select committee, because once it's referred to a select committee, it goes out for submissions, and then a cross-party group look at those very issues that we are seeking to address. We know that we're like little mice on a treadmill, just going through the motions, ticking boxes, but unable, I'm not going to say incapable, unable to actually take the strategic directions that we need to meet the people of Auckland's expectation of transport. And so the question, because I'm mindful this must be a question, is could you please explain if we have approached local members? Because I'm aware that there might be a number of local members across the parliamentary and political divide that would be interested in this, and then what would then likely happen?
Thank you, Councillor, for the excellent question. I think the answer to the first question is yes, we have approached local members about this, although, you know, in fairness to the governing body and councillors, we've wanted to work through this process before we get too detailed about that. But we have spoken with local members of Parliament who have expressed a interest, maybe even an eagerness to be involved in this and to work with council on putting forward, you know, sponsoring a local bill and working through the details of it. And the intention is that if a local bill was to be sponsored or it was to be taken up as a government bill and into the House, that Auckland Council would be intimately involved in the select committee process, and that we would be hoping for a fairly bipartisan, cross-party approach to figuring out the transport, how the transport system in Auckland should be governed for the future. So there seems to be an eagerness among parliamentarians to be involved in that process, and I think the select committee process, if we did get there, would probably yield a better piece of legislation as a result.
So my second part to that question is, how common is it for a bill introduced to Parliament of this kind that meets support for then to be adopted as a government bill in the final stages? I mean, I asked that question in the context of ones that I sponsored in my years, things like the Cancer Registry Act, the female genital mutilation legislation that we now have. These entered because they were sponsored but then became government legislation. Can you advise in terms of recent times what the practice is likely to be to those who feel that this should be government legislation?
I think, thanks, Councillor. I think you've sort of answered the question with the question, but yeah, my understanding is that it's a very common practice. You propose a local bill, it's very common then to ask the government to pick it up, and if the government supports it, that you know, it is a common practice that they will then do so, particularly if they want to make changes. So that would the other point I would make is that yes, local bills often deal with smaller topics, but there is no local government as large as Auckland Council. We are unique, and so if any local authority was going to propose a local bill which was of greater significance than the usual local bill, it would be Auckland Council that would be doing that, and perhaps it's time that we did.
Right, thank you, Councillor Fletcher. And final question, Councillor Dalton. So it's okay? So I think the Mayor would like to move the recommendations if the person out the front can leave the front. And well, I'm happy for Councillor Fletcher to bow to seniority on that one to second it. So we have it moved and seconded, and it's now up for debate. And I think we had a couple of people who indicated an interest in speaking. Councillor Lee.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I support the Mayor's proposal. I support the recommendations. I do take on board the letter received from the Chair of AT, and his advice is well worth considering, given his experience both in local government and in the Ministry of Transport. And his view is that a much more comprehensive reform needs to take place. However, in the meantime, I see no contradiction in moving ahead with this change. Auckland Council's position, if this is passed, has not changed. When the super city, so-called, was established, regional transport committees were the province of the Auckland Council. It was in 2012 and 13 when the bill became law, that Minister Stephen Joyce, I understand, pushed these changes, and as one of the key architects of the Auckland Council reform, along with Honourable Minister Hyde, Mr. Joyce was a key player in the Super City reform, probably the key player actually. He created Auckland Transport, which still is absolutely unique in New Zealand. And subsequently, he changed the Act 3 years later to reinforce the role and responsibilities and indeed the power of Auckland Transport by integrating regional transport committees. Somewhat bizarrely, I have to say, as a function of the unelected directors of Auckland Transport. It never really sat comfortably in practical terms, because the whole culture in New Zealand and the whole purpose of the Act is to engage with the public. Elected people are accountable to the public, whereas directors, whatever their ability, are not directly accountable. And so the whole culture of this country and this legislation is based on elected people being accountable for the money. It's the taxation representation principle, and that is why originally in Auckland and everywhere else in the country right now, transport committees, regional transport committees, are carried out by elected people in regional councils and in the territorial local authorities, and also there are roles for special interest groups, disabled people, I think, if I recall, and also there was special citizens co-opted who represented walking and cycling and so on. And that's how it worked in Auckland under the Auckland Regional Council, and that's how it works in the rest of the country. So I see this as aligning Auckland back with the system of local and regional government and transport administration in the rest of this country. There's one thing that that I found somewhat weak in the AT approach. It was competent enough, but because of the somewhat one steps removed from the public, as it were, in terms of RLTP and the Public Transport Management Plan, over time, this has moved away from direct consultation to more like led, managed, have your say sorts of events and online feedback, bloody blah, blah. They're not the only ones. This council is guilty of that ourselves in terms of our responsibility to consult with the public under the Land Transport Act. Even the special consultative procedure may be considered for our RLTPs, and unfortunately may is thought by management to represent don't have to and therefore will not. And so what I would suggest, if we are to take this role back, we have to start thinking a little bit more, somewhat more, about the public when it comes to transport, and particularly public transport. And I would like to see that principle embodied in these recommendations, that one of the motivations are not just for Auckland Council to take back this role, to take back this responsibility, to take back this power, but also because we're doing it not for our own aggrandisement, but we're doing it to be closer and more accountable to the people of Auckland. And we need to, I think, I think if I recall from annual plan discussions, there is a commitment at least consider proper full hearings in the next LTP, which is, I think, is a requirement in my view. But I think in these important matters, the RLTP, the Public Transport Management Plan, we should allow the public to come into the room and interact with us and hear what they have to say. And I think people will be surprised how much value that adds to the process. So yes, with those remarks, I would say that I support the recommendation. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Councillor Lee. That's certainly set the scene as far as the historical perspective here that is very important. So we have waiting to speak Councillor Philippina, Dalton, Newman, Fletcher, Williamson and Councillor Baker. Councillor Philippina.
Thank you, Chair, and I'm glad that I'm following Councillor Lee, because I also was going to reiterate around the 2013 legislation that Councillor Lee has mentioned. Chair, I will be supporting the recommendations, and part of the reason I asked all the questions that I did is because I would rather have us go down the non-legislative and working with Auckland Transport, but as Alistair said, you know, we were going to try and sort of do that, didn't have the opportunity to do that with the last statement of intent, but then with the addition of D, E and F, I sort of changed in regards to supporting it. I did, however, go through the CCO review again, and on page 7 is the Auckland Transport 4 recommendations in there, or 4 statements in there, and then I looked at pages 33 to 39, which was all in regards to Auckland Transport. So the addition to D, E and F, and also I think for us it's now time to put a line in the sand in regards to the setting of the strategy and policy. So, Chair, very quickly, I will be supporting it. Kilda.
Thank you, Councillor Philippina. Councillor Dalton.
I'll be quick too, because I'm more or less going to say the same as Alf. I did want to acknowledge the letter from the Chair and the Deputy Chair. I've always felt very strongly about the relationships that we should hold with our CCO governors. And I think that the line in there that says that their board's usual desire is to have a strategic governance conversation and form a collaborative view, and that is what we should be doing. We know in an ideal world we wouldn't need to go down a legislative track to do this, but I take the point on where we have come from and how this has worked well, and this aligns us now with other councils. I support that. I think it's actually could be very good, because sometimes, you know, be careful what you wish for, right? We're now going to be even more accountable. And I remember, was it last year, the RLTP, where Auckland Transport got taken to court by the climate change lawyers. That will now be us if we can't get the RLTP right. So an opportunity for us to really follow through on our commitments that we have made through the Climate Action Plan, through the TERP, to be able to set a plan for Auckland that is going to get us where we need to go. And hopefully, you know, we will get all the information and the advice that we need to be able to get there alongside Auckland Transport, and in particular, people that have done so much work for us, like Michael Roth and others in our growth transport and infrastructure strategy team, doing incredible work and have worked hard to try and get things over the line and haven't quite got there. So this is actually going to be a great opportunity for us to take more responsibility and be held accountable as much as we're holding Auckland Transport accountable for not delivering on our expectations. So I support you, Mayor, on this, and looking forward to the journey. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Dalton. Councillor Newman.
In the CCO review, I made my submission to the panel on that I felt that the Part 4 provisions of the Lagaka were obsolete. We were an outlier. Auckland region was treated differently. That was not right. That there was a need for change. That didn't end up being adopted as part of that CCO review, more unfortunately. I do support this because I think that the bill should be a government bill, but I mean, the Mayor is right, and the Mayor is working in the right direction on this. It's a pity that we couldn't have done this in years past, but this is a very good start. I am not sure how it flows that, you know, at the moment, our relationship with Auckland Transport is for its statement of intent. Thankfully, that is now passed. But it goes to the point, Chair, if there is concern about the responsibilities that are going to fall on us under this new legislation, well, it is our responsibility as people who are elected with a mandate, and we fulfil our mandate. And Councillor Lee is right. Ultimately, the best mechanism in an organisation like Auckland Council is for decision-making and responsibility to sit with those people who govern, not with unelected directors. And it would be good to be able to bring us into alignment with how the rest of the country governs its transport arrangements to the extent that we can. I do hope, through you, Chair, that the Mayor continues to have a degree of success with transport spokespeople from all parties about this ultimately folding into what will be a government bill. It will not be addressed before the election, but I do hope that it will inform thinking after the election, because there will be a government of whatever colour, and that ultimately these are matters that I think are best addressed through a government bill. And so certainly if this is helpful to kick that off, then that's good. In the meantime, I'm pleased that we passed a statement of intent.
Thank you, Councillor Newman. Councillor Fletcher.
Oh, I think others have traversed, particularly Councillor Lee, why we should be supporting this. But I just want to take us back a little while. Amalgamation for Auckland largely came around in the first instance because we had so many layers in terms of decision making. You had all the legacy councils, you had the mayoral forum, which in many ways was sort of, it was a non-statutory grouping. People knew, common sense dictated that people needed to come together to make decisions, but there was no legal requirement for them to do so. And if there was any one thing that drove amalgamation, it was transport. We could talk about stadia and all sorts of other things, but primarily it was about transport. And the legislation that was ultimately passed was defective. And yes, I do hold some severe grudges against Rodney Hyde because it's put us off to a really bad start. However, it became apparent, and certainly the lobbying that many of us undertook, to say, look, there's a whole range of areas within the Auckland legislation that need fixing. I think governments, whether you're talking about the government of John Key or whether we're talking about subsequent governments, nobody has really wanted to touch it because Auckland legislation, by and large, by governments, is seen as toxic. And they don't want to fall foul of the general public. So we pushed, some of us pushed really hard for that CCO review, and he doesn't often get much credit around here, but John Tamihere was the one that really pushed that during the election campaign for the mayoralty, for the need for a CCO review. And I think that that was a positive step. It was accepted on the election campaign by the then Mayor, Phil Goff, that we did need that review. But the idea from the beginning of a sort of a clean decision-making process has it's morphed into something really complex again, whether we're talking about Light Rail Limited, whether we're talking about CRL Limited, Kiwi Rail, Waka Kotahi, I could go on and on and on. And everything I've seen, you know, it's been foreshadowed to us there will be greater levels of complexity that will come in with RMA reform. Sooner or later, we need to do something if we are to deliver effectively and be accountable for the $30 billion worth of investment that we have agreed to do over the next 30 odd years. There does need to be clarity around decision making. What is being proposed here is not quite perfect. I would be the first to agree. Some might say, why is the Mayor doing this and why would the Minister do that? I think these are all the sorts of things that will get ironed out during the select committee process. And what we are doing today is simply giving officers a sense of direction in communicating with the Office of the Clerk, in enabling them to speak with the parliamentarians, you know, and we all hope that this will be a cross-party thing. So I just want to conclude on saying, good on the Mayor, this is long, long overdue, and I am grateful that he has had the single-mindedness through his office to really try and advance this, and I hope that it can be supported by everyone. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Fletcher. Councillor Williamson, perhaps you could clarify your role in 210 and 213 and all of this?
I would have to serve time within a penitentiary based on my role within the... look, I want to just agree with a number of the councillors here, so I'm not going to repeat a lot of that, but I do want to stress one thing. We're quite different to everything else in New Zealand that's called a local authority. We are way more like a state government in any other country you can name. For example, we've got 34% of New Zealand's population. There isn't a single state in Australia that comes near 34%. Not a state, not New South Wales even, the massive population isn't 34%. In the United States, where I've been for a while, lots and lots and lots of states have less than 1 million people in them. And they have a state government. And that state government has the power to do a whole range of things that a local authority does not. Taxation abilities, revenue raising, and so on. So I'd suggest this. You will not get more open ears from politicians than in the next 2 months. That they're falling over backwards to try to want to get people to vote for them in all regards. And I don't think the words up there to take it to the incoming government, I saw on one of the big sheets, to take this proposal to the incoming government is right. I think you should be taking this to them earlier and trying to get them to take a position, because I think there is real merit in what we're proposing to take back some of the controls that the original legislation took away. And I actually think they'd be very reluctant to fight against us, to argue against us, because Auckland is where elections are won. Yeah. Auckland is where elections are won, and my view is that really, I don't think you'll get this through as a local bill. I've actually had to reject several local bills in my history because they were outside of scope, too convoluted and complex, and I think you'll find there'll be arguments from the clerk's office that this doesn't meet the criteria for a local bill. No harm in putting it up, and no harm in saying, well, who salutes it? Run it up the flagpole, see who salutes it. And I tell you what, none of the major parties out there, in my view, would be prepared to fight against you on this one right now. They won't listen very much after the 15th of October, but right now is when they'll listen. Thank you.
Okay, so thanks, Councillor Williamson. We've got Councillor Baker.
Oh, good to listen to the odour of government it is. Yeah, look, I support this, and I particularly just wanted to, and again, I like Councillor Darby before, just thank the Mayor, I suppose, for the willingness to incorporate F. And so yesterday we had at the Auckland Transport Committee meeting, we had a little session on the letter that was written, and it was by the Chair and Deputy, and it was unanimously supported, including Chris and I, because I think what it shows is that the Auckland Transport Board and Auckland Transport as an organisation is really, really willing to actually look at change and to work with council to actually do change. And we've seen that in the you know, as you read out before, Mr. Chair, the sort of the preamble from the chair and the SOI. So, look, I just want to make sure though that there is really a commitment to collaborate with Auckland Transport, and that we do see that. And I've mentioned it to a couple of people, and I mentioned it to Auckland Transport yesterday. I think one of the missing pieces, this is a really complex puzzle, and one of the missing pieces is that we as governors do not get together, and we haven't got together. So the Board of Auckland Transport and this governing body have never actually sat down as a group in this term and had a workshop and had a chat about what's really important to us. And I'd really love to see, as potentially part of this of this project, that we do that, and that we get together and we just have an open discussion about what it is we want, because we spend so much time firing letters and emails and making statements and meetings like this, when actually it's built on some sort of, I guess, misunderstanding, and I guess the privilege that Mike and I and Chris and I now have of sitting around that board is listening to the debates that they have as a board, and it'd be really good to be able to do that. So I'll be voting for this, Mr. Mayor. I appreciate it, and I think it's a good step.
All right, just the right of reply now from Mayor Brown. Perhaps you could address the issue that Councillor Williamson brought up too in that reply, Mr. Mayor.
Yeah, well, thanks for everybody for their input, and thanks for the general levels of support. This is fixing a problem that's been around for a while. One of the advantages that the council have over Auckland Transport, and I'm completely happy with the working together thing. I mean, I never suspected we wouldn't. But you do find as mayor you can actually bring in the other ones which are out there. Auckland Light Rail, or City Rail Link, and AT have had trouble getting into those ones as well. As mayor, you get a chance to have a lot more to do with the IMSB and with my fellow iwi sponsors for Auckland Light Rail, and I've very much enjoyed the support. In terms of Councillor Williamson suggesting that, where's a bit about the government, to request the Mayor to advocate for legislative change giving effect to the principles above to be a priority for the incoming government. That's exactly what I'm doing. I'm pinning these buggers down on both sides. You never know what might happen, to make sure that they do support this. And I've got very senior people who, I think Max said before, they're quite eager to. And they're eager to now, of course, before the election. But being eager and supporting me and then changing your mind later on is a very career-limiting move. And so I'm fully on top of taking effect of item B. And I'm very happy to have included D, E and F. I have listened to my fellow councillors, and that all makes sense. Really, this should never have had to have been done. It is ridiculous that the Horowhenua Council, whoever that is, can set up their RLTP, and we can't. So I look forward to this getting through, and thank you for your support.
Hey, thanks, Mr. Mayor. So it's been moved and seconded. All those in favour, please say aye. Aye. Against? Okay, declared that carried unanimously. If we want to send a message to our parliamentary colleagues, a unanimous vote at Auckland Council, a rare and wonderful thing. Yeah, no, sorry, we've got two in a row here. We're going to be on a hat trick. Okay.